From Clubhouses to Congress, How Women Have Shaped Community. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Before 1920, how did women shape and improve the world around them? Women used their fellowship in clubs and Christian organizations to enact change and have a voice. These organizations became a gateway to passing women's suffrage. In 1914 and 15, the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Company circulated these cards to encourage women to be independent. Here, a young girl in an old-fashioned dress approaches a young Uncle Sam. An example of pro-suffrage marketing is this sample ballot, which showed voters, who were men, where to check to make sure that they passed women's suffrage in California in 1911. Women were fighting for more than just the right to vote. They wanted communities where everyone could thrive. Here we have the platform for the Santa Clara County Equal Suffrage Association, where they were fighting for items such as abolishing child labor, having compulsory universal education, enacting pure food legislation to protect people from adulterated and misbranded foods. They believed that domestic science should be taught in public schools, that prisons, hospitals, and asylums needed reform, wanted sanitary regulations, and believed that newspapers were the best medium of education and reform, and wanted the press to be made more reliable and dignified. They also believed in general public improvements and in equality before the law and universal suffrage with an educational clause. Shaping community. Women's clubs have long been a part of American history, gaining popularity in the post-Civil War years. During the Progressive Era, from 1890 to 1920, women's groups were considered a mainstream movement focused on social activism and political reform. They addressed problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, founded in 1890, provided a socially accepted opportunity for women to meet as equals, share ideas, and exert a positive influence on their community. Campbell had many vibrant women's clubs, including a few that were affiliated with the General Federation of Women's Clubs. These clubs developed plans for civic improvement, such as child labor laws, city health reform, access to public education, and building libraries. It should be noted that this exhibit is drawing from the history of Campbell and its community. So the clubs and the club women associated with Campbell were all white and Protestant. The issues and concerns of these women, while they fought to improve society, were still heavily influenced through their narrow lens of what life was. Concepts like inclusion or diversity probably didn't even cross their minds, or they didn't pay it much attention. When they're fighting for things like child labor and the end of prostitution, they're probably imagining white communities like their own. As these clubs evolved over time, obviously, so did their platforms. In 1905, the Campbell chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was established. The National Women Christians Temperance Union officially endorsed suffrage as a way of protecting the home, women, and children. At the time, women were considered morally superior to men. Therefore, the Women's Christian Temperance Union encouraged women to use their moral influence for the good of society and to enter the political arena to effect reforms necessary to protect the home through welfare programs, local law enforcement, equal labor rights, preventing human trafficking, and of course, prohibition. In 1912, the Campbell Women's Christian Temperance Union worked along with the Campbell Country Women's Club to prohibit a racetrack from being built nearby, due to the gambling it would encourage. In 1919, the Campbell Women's Christian Temperance Union raised funds for the Americanization of foreigners, with the goal of ensuring that new immigrants gained, quote, a true comprehension of American ideals and principles, end quote, whatever those were. The Campbell Country Women's Club was officially chartered in 1905. The Country Women's Club focused on literature and campaigned to bring culture and education to the community through the growth of the Campbell Free Library. In 1907, the Country Women's Club used funds to build a small wooden building on South First Street, and by 1923, the Women's Club had worked tirelessly to construct a Campbell Country Women's Club building that would also house the library collection. This building still stands today at 274 East Campbell Avenue. The Campbell Country Women's Club championed many other civic projects, including building a road to Big Basin, supporting a 1913 state law to curtail or eliminate prostitution, and fighting for local park improvements. This newspaper clipping is from the Campbell Press, published September of 1912, noting that the Campbell Women's Christian Temperance Union had adopted the National Prohibition Platform, which covered much more than prohibition, including support for women's suffrage. Ida Price, the founder of the Campbell Country Women's Club, was quoted as saying, "Our biggest victory was when we plain country women decided to outstep the pleasures and privileges and privacies of our home life and take upon us that certain amount of publicity which this work makes necessary." Pictured here are the presidents of the Country Women's Club from 1905 through 1949. The Suffrage Movement. In 1848, women organized the suffrage movement for the right to equality and the right to vote. They challenged the traditional expectations that a woman's role was only domestic and focused on the home. She could also seek to improve her community. Anti-suffragists argued that women were not intellectually fit for politics, and women's reform measures would upend the traditional gender norms that threaten white male hegemony by allowing women of color and other ethnic groups to vote. Businesses like large-scale agriculture, liquor, and the railroads funded anti-suffrage propaganda to protect their economies from reforms such as child labor laws, temperance, minimum wage, maximum working hours, and equal pay. Women's clubs had long been campaigning for these reform measures, though they could not actually vote for them. The suffrage movement worked on local levels to gain support, securing the right to vote through a state-by-state campaign. In 1911, California became the 6th state to give women the right to vote. In 1917, the issue of suffrage became a national campaign when the U.S. entered World War I. The men were off fighting and women entered the workforce in non-traditional roles. The suffrage movement gained the endorsement of President Wilson and got the momentum it needed to be passed through Congress. In August of 1920, the country gained universal suffrage with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." When you are accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression, and many men felt threatened by suffrage. Here we have a cookbook marketed towards women to encourage their husbands to vote no on women's suffrage. Some of the claims they make are, because 90% of women either do not want it or they don't care. Because it means the competition of women with men instead of cooperation. Because 80% of women eligible to vote are married and can only double or annul their husband's votes. Because it can be of no benefit commensurate with the additional expense involved. Because in some states, more voting women than voting men will place the government under petticoat rule. Because it is unwise to risk the good we already have for the evil which may occur. Another post we have says, "America when feminized." These anti-suffragist campaigns capitalized on the fear of the breakdown of gender roles and the disruption of the American home. The family construct as they knew it was under attack. Anti-suffragist advertisements featured men coming home to dirty diapers, dishes in the sink, and an uncooked dinner. Or worse, the man was doing the chores himself. As we can see here, we have a chicken leaving her rooster husband to take care of the eggs. Next to that, we have a postcard of a man saying he wants to vote, but his wife won't let him. and the poor thing is left washing the laundry and taking care of his baby. From clubhouses to Congress. Campbell's women's clubs were part of the fight for suffrage, both in 1911 for California's women's right to vote and in 1920 for national suffrage. Suffragist leaders became adept in using women's clubs as part of their grassroots political campaign. The anti-suffragists had footholds in larger cities, so California suffragists focused on rural areas like the Santa Clara Valley and Campbell, and talked to local women's groups, labor unions, and church groups. They trained women to spread the word in their own communities. When the votes for suffrage in the 1911 California election were tallied, it was rural districts like Campbell that made the difference for a narrow victory. The Campbell Women's Christian Temperance Union strongly supported the passing of suffrage in California and nationally, often hosting speakers on the topic of suffrage. In 1914, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, with over 2 million club women across the nation, white and non-white, formally endorsed the national suffrage movement. The Campbell Country Women's Club 1920 Secretary Book notes the importance of registering women to vote in the 1920 election. Quote, "As women have the privilege of voting, they should do so, or the vote might be taken away from us. There has been some talk of doing so, and we should be especially interested this presidential year." End quote. One Campbell citizen, Sam Jones, was quoted in the Campbell Interurban Press in 1896 as saying, "I believe in women's suffrage rather than women's suffering, and if anybody ought to be out fighting the devil and whiskey, it is the women." In 1912, the first year that California women could vote, Campbell's women, including many of the members of the Campbell Women's Clubs, were registered. Pictured here is a partial page of registered Campbell voters, where we can see the names of these club women listed. After women won the right to vote, women's clubs continued in helping women exercise their rights and even enter into politics. In 1985, Campbell Country Women Club member Jeanette Watson became the first woman on the Campbell City Council, and in 1988, she became the first female mayor for Campbell. Though women have gained access to equal voting rights and political offices, the country has yet to elect a woman president. As local women's groups continue to be a part of the Campbell, Santa Clara County, and national communities, women's efforts to reach the highest political office in the country will also continue. Campbell was the last city in Santa Clara County to elect a woman to its city council. According to this article from 1984, Campbell was the only city in the county's 15 cities that had never elected a woman to its city council. Women had served or were presently sitting on all 14 other city and town councils, and 12 of those 14 municipalities had already had women mayors. The only time that Campbell came close was in 1978 when 2 women ran for council. They lost to 2 male candidates, and no woman had run since. Why is that? One of the male city council members, who was in his 5th term at the time of the article, said that it wasn't about chauvinism. He said, "There are no smoke-filled back rooms in City Hall. We are not woman haters, for Pete's sake. Anybody can run, and if they're not wanted, they won't be elected." But Madge Overhouse, one of the women who ran in 1978, said that the councilman had it wrong. Quote, "Campbell's in a time warp. It's like a small town over in the valley. There aren't many places where there's still a women's club or a garden club. In Campbell, it's the family, St. Lucy's Church, the Rotary Club, all these. Campbell is a walled city for women." Arlene Evans, the other woman who ran in 1978, wasn't quite as critical. She was quoted as saying, quote, "I felt good about running and I did my best, but I really don't think there was any voter prejudice. I raised 8 children and I thought a homemaker's point of view was needed on the council, but apparently I was wrong." End quote. According to the article, other prominent Campbell women, for one reason or another, have declined to run for council. The article cites Jeanette Watson and Barbara Conant as two of these women, and with the luxury of me being in the future, I can tell you that both Jeanette and Barbara did end up on Campbell City Council in the late 1980s. Today, the current City Council, through November of 2020, has two women in the top spots, Susan Landry as mayor and Liz Gibbons as vice mayor. With a third councilwoman, Ann Bybee, Campbell has its first female majority.